So as we talked about, folks have been coming and flooding to the major cities, first in Europe, um, post-industrial revolution, that is. First, many of the European cities, London, Paris, Munich, and then ultimately into the United States and urban centers such as Detroit, St. Louis, Philadelphia, DC, New York, and Chicago became more populated as more and more people came seeking industrial work. As we talked about before, you all have to do papers speaking on the three revolutions and the role that they played in urban development. So again, we have the agricultural, the industrial, and then the urban revolutions of the late 19th and early 20th century. As we also discussed, people coming and flooding to these areas required more and more organization of the resources, housing, education, sanitation, etc. This required some very deliberate urban planning, and this is the focus of the lecture today. As we have been discussing throughout, the physical environment has, a big influence on, it constrains our behavior. That when we talked about urbanism last time, over the last couple of classes, how it kind of like creates a certain state of mind, if you will. The Jim and Chef, Jezel Chef divide, not only in terms of division of labor, but just in terms of the structures of the communities themselves and the people that they produce. Additionally, cities began to, particularly in the industrial West, but I suppose it's always been true, but really began to shape and form the society's values and its culture itself. In this regard, city planners, such as some of the gentlemen, and they were always gentlemen at this stage, will become some of the more powerful and influential individuals in the 20th century. And much of their aim, explicit aim, was to try and overcome some of the problems associated with city life. We talked about many of those problems last time in the chapter on the Chicago School. And again, the crime, the suicide, domestic abuse, poverty. You had a lot of these issues emerging. And you needed some folks to try and figure out how to go about dealing with it. So city planners began to come about and develop as a profession in the early 20th century. And we'll talk about in this chapter. Again, I won't test you quite as much on names, but you definitely want to know that they have very different models and designs of what these urban environments should look like. So again, you won't be tested on names. You do need to be familiar with the concepts and ideas. And by this, the Broadacre city was a certain type of city, structured and designed in a particular type of way. You need to be able to distinguish that from the Radiant City, the Garden City, the City Beautiful movement, etc. With you all having surely read this chapter already, you know that these designers, these planners, are associated with very different cities, and these cities, in many ways, still take on the nature of these initial city planners. Let's look at each more closely. Again, as we've talked about throughout, it's really important to stay up to speed with the material and see how, again, don't view the slides, do not view the chapters in isolation, but as one continuous story and be able to see how they connect. in your papers, in many ways, your requirement is to try and recapture this story. As we described, like in many ways, we're going through the evolution of human beings, going from hunter and gathering to wider agricultural based communities where you could gather and settle more people in one place for extended periods of time. The technology coming about with the Industrial Revolution that made it where increasingly food production could be concentrated amongst a very few. It could be done by fewer and fewer people, and that made it where to sustain yourself, you often would have to come and render your services to some of these industrialists who own the machines and factories that were driving the new industrial revolution that first began in Europe, spread over to America, quickly led to population increases in urban environments such as Cincinnati, Detroit, Kansas City, as many people migrated north from the antebellum South, as well as from Europe, as the competition for labor there really began to heighten. And one of the places that a lot of these people came was Chicago, Illinois. But as we talked about last time, it was a really new and unique environment to have so many different people from so many different cultures, coming all at once in such a short amount of time. And in many ways, Chicago then and now has often been linked to social disorder and danger. There were some events that precipitated this reputation then and now. One of the more significant ones was the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And one of the reasons why that happened is that, you had so many people concentrated, right on top of each other. So that a fire at, the old wives' tale was Mrs. O'Leary's cow tipped over a lamp. Scientists have debunked some of that, but that's neither here nor there. Somebody started the fire, and it set much of the city ablaze. Keep this in mind as we'll revisit this shortly. You also had the Haymarket bombing in 1876, where that was great, in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Chicago was one of the sites of incredible levels of labor and management tension. One such incident that really highlighted this was a Haymarket bombing, which was carried out, and again, there's still some historical debate over this, but by so-called anarchists that were sensitive and supportive of the labor movement. And it was just, again, another example of how, things are just getting out of control and becoming a lot more difficult to manage all these different people with all their different customs. The Pullman labor strike, again, the Pullman Railroads company was one of the most important companies in the development of the early railway system in America, which was one of the more lucrative businesses of the time. And a lot of the wealth that exists in America today can still be traced back to that. So the Pullman labor strike was really, not only affected, obviously Chicago, but, with these being, a regional train line, really affected things, all across the country and showed the power of labor, which many people felt, was very dangerous and threatening. In addition to that, the city, then and now, unfortunately, was characterized by inadequate housing. Again, you had a lot of people coming in a short amount of time. Keep in mind that we talked about before that before 1830, there were less than 100,000 people in the Chi. And by less than a century later, it was over 3 million people. It's just an incredible rise in population. This made it where there just wasn't sufficient housing for people. The streets were very filthy. There was even before the advent of like automobiles and things like that, there was amount of air pollution. Is again, we talked about the Industrial Revolution and all these machines and factories, and they were just blowing smoke out any and everywhere. Poor sewage systems, hard to get clean water, which we talked about in the beginning, is very important. And many believe that all these problems were the result of an unplanned city. Again, you want people to come up here for this labor, but you haven't really made accommodations and thought out how you're going to set things up to be able to deal with this shift. But as human beings are, apt to behave, we don't believe that things are just inevitable. That through some level of social engineering, we can change the environment. Again, keep in mind what we talked about before, how the physical environment influences our behavior. And when you're talking about things like the Haymarket bombing, some of the crime that the Chicago school scholars would explore, roughly 50, 60 years later, that a lot of these things will be explained by the physical environment itself. It was believed that if you could, you know, um, create, pun intended, a beautiful environment, that it can produce beautiful people. So this idea was introduced by Burnham, a prominent Chicago architect, and he set out to redevelop urban areas throughout the city. As always, as you take notes, please do not only focus on what's on the PowerPoint. Do not only focus what's on the PowerPoint. What's being articulated is often most important. But I'll leave this up for you for a moment so you can digest the lecture more fully. So one of the things that he wanted to introduce early on was just more parks. Again, increasingly, the workers are, bringing their families, starting families, want to have places, where again, kids can play and interact, and people can just, get some space and room for the hustle and bustle, and kind of slow down a bit. As we talked about again, there were so many people coming all at once. So it made sense to create some wider boulevards, simply making the streets bigger, give people more room to, move around. And there was great attention to like wanting to really like create standout architecture. That the classic cities of Europe are known for this. That people, will come to those cities and they stand out and are world renowned for, again, their architecture and design. And having been in each of these cities, you can definitely see the distinction there. Where Athens, even in modern times, makes efforts to really capture and encompass their classical period, as is Rome. So instantly, when you think of these cities, the Eiffel Tower, the Colosseum, that these buildings immediately stand out and kind of are, give you symbolic imagery of the city. And when you go to these places, like, you want to, that is a must for you to see those particular monuments. Burton wanted to do this for Chicago. He also believed that by improving the physical environment and making it more beautiful, that it would improve not only the civic pride and loyalty of its citizens, but it actually would improve the morals. One of the first displays of this was the Columbian Exposition of 1893 and the so-called White City. Again, we talked about, this involved establishing many public parks that would be maintained and managed by the city. One of these parks would be a 20-mile lakeside park along the shores of Lake Michigan. And again, if you ever have a chance to visit, I would highly recommend going during the summer. This weekend there, it'll be about 1 to 2 degrees. So this might not be the best time, but much of this, again, you can see still today the literal blueprint that Burnham laid out. Or to have a large civic center, again, for people to be able to interact and see and get entertained. A new railroad terminal to make it where people could get in and about the city a lot more easily. Some of these ideas took longer than others to be able to enact, but all of these were eventually realized. But in spite of this, and Burnham is to be commended for many of these achievements, it still left a great deal many of the city residents deprived and isolated. We talked about the concentric zone before, where the further you got away from the city center, the more that you saw the poverty and crime reproduce, that was gave this reputation of fear. So it wasn't necessarily in this way eliminating some of these issues. It just kind of isolated them and put them in certain pockets of the city that didn't mess with the business. We also had introduced in this chapter the Garden City movement, where again some concerns was that with the best housing often concentrated in certain parts of the city, was not dispersed everywhere. That there will be some areas that will be overcrowded. And the poor, again, they remained in really appalling physical environments. And as I said, that, and this is true of almost all of these models, quite frankly, it wasn't an elimination of some of the, the treasures of the city. It just kind of, hid and obscured them. And you almost begin to have, two cities where there's a sharp dividing line between rich and poor. Again, Chicago is a really great case study for this because it's really, really, really blatant and explicit. One of the main streets, the central dividing line between East and West is State Street in Chicago. And if you drive along State Street, you can literally see this in very clear-cut ways. It's almost like you're going back in time on some levels. Others, again, wanted to see, like we talked about, the lament of the breakdown and losing some aspects of rural life, and some of the community came along with it, and just, some of the access to nature. So there were developers that wanted to kind of recapture this, where as opposed to just having this gritty, polluted, overcrowded urban environment, that you also could have within there, like, some kind of rural space to move around. This called for some level of urban decentralization, where again, we talked about, how in the concentric zone model, where you had this really concentrated, well-developed city center that was very isolated and marginalized from the rest of the city. Apologies, gentlemen, and thank you for sending the email. Begin. So the lecture, as always, is recorded, being pre-recorded. I'll go back over what I was speaking on a moment ago. And as always, make note of the attendance policy for the course of being on camera. So we have been talking about throughout how, again, like you had all these people coming, to these city centers in a very short amount of time. And I'll try and go back over this very briefly. People again coming after the Industrial Revolution in particular, and so this is where the most competitive jobs are at. You got people coming, from post-slavery through the Great Migration coming from the South. You have many immigrant populations coming from Europe. And we talked about before how, like, in 1830, the population of Chicago was roughly less than 100,000. And in less than a century, you're getting over to like 3 million people. So this created, like, a lot of problems in terms of sanitation, in terms of housing, in terms of, education, in terms of health, that many of these places weren't really fully prepared for. And we talked about in the section on the Chicago school, how that led to, a lot of disruption and social pathologies that were, greatly concerning. This also came with the recognition that one of the things that the Chicago school researchers not only brought in terms of urban sociology, but just sociology, period, is the important role that the physical environment has on human behavior. A lot of human behavior previous to this would be explained by, genetics, you possessed by the devil, something like that. But it's during this period that we begin to look more at the role that the physical environment plays. And one of the things, again, so Stephen, in addition to talking about the German chef, chef divide in terms of the division of labor, which is really important, it also speaks to like it produces a different type of person. That, again, that if an individual moves from a rural environment to, somewhere like, Philadelphia, New York, or Detroit of this era, just the way that they see the world will be transformed as well. These recognitions made it where city planners began to emerge, and this is still a lucrative career today, to try and overcome some of these problems that we talked about in the last chapter. They were probably plaguing cities like Chicago most acutely, but increasingly were felt everywhere. London, Paris, Cincinnati, St. Louis, etc. As always, I'm not going to test you very heavily on names, but you do need to know the concepts. And what these concepts are philosophies, if you will, of how to structure an urban environment in a way that tries to affect the environment in very deliberate ways. As always, make sure you're listening while you're taking notes. Don't just write stuff down. So again, what you're writing down here is these represent different philosophies about how to structure and design a city in a way that's really going to affect the individuals living in them. These are used in different cities, and these models in many ways still hold and are still used today. Frank Lloyd Wright's The Broadacre City, The Radiant City of Le Corbusier, The Garden City method introduced by Ebenezer Howard, and Daniel Burnham's City Beautiful movement. Again, you will not be tested on names. You do want to make sure that you have a good working understanding of the ideas. So if you don't know them today, it's not the end of the world. But if I ask you, if we're in class and I ask you to describe and break these down within the next week, please be prepared to do so. Again, to understand these models, it's really important to understand what they're responding to. So again, like, then and now, Chicago was linked, and when people thought of it in the national mythology at the time, that it was linked to social disorder and danger. A lot of crime, prostitution, rape, just anything goes. Whatever you want to do, it was going to be all good. And you have people coming and, you got these Italian people, these Irish people, these Polish people, these Black folks that have very different cultures and norms that they're bringing to this space that are also viewed as very threatening and frightening to a lot of people. There were some historical events that, again, like were linked to and dramatized as fear. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And even though you won't be tested on dates, it can be helpful to really think about this stuff chronologically. Again, when you talk about the three revolutions, like it's important that, I think it'll be helpful to understand, going from the hunter and gathering period, agriculture, industrial revolution. And then once we get to the industrial revolution, much of our discussion is going to be post that. All the different changes and shifts and dynamics and considerations that cities have to undergo. A lot of our discussions throughout the rest of the class is going to be, okay, you got all these people that came from the Industrial Revolution. How are we going to design and shape these cities to deal with that? And then, as I'm sure you all are aware, we're now in a period of the post-industrial revolution. So we'll talk about much later, but make sure you're listening. How cities like Detroit became very depopulated as more and more factories, where, the factories left Detroit, and where did they go? Anybody recall? Well, this isn't anything you would have read, but just, your observations of society. So once these factories left Detroit, where did they go? No wrong answer. Well, there are wrong guesses, but you don't get any penalties for guessing wrong.
Oh, I'm sorry. You said when the factories left Detroit, the first thing I think of when jobs leaving is going overseas.
Absolutely, Steve. Very good. One extra credit point, sir. So those cities, so those factories, and then Stephen, hear me out. When we talk about the Industrial Revolution not going to the east and it's going to places in Asia and China, that's because now those factory jobs are going to the big cities in China, Philippines, India, and you got people flooding over there now that used to be farmers. So the things that the city planners had to deal with here in 19th century Chicago, people got to deal with that all over the world now. So you had the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 was a major precipitating event. And there are different, mythologies about, how this started. The myth we always heard as a kid was Miss O'Leary's cow tipped over this lantern and it set her barn on fire, and then woof, the rest of the city went down with it. Scientists have debated that theory in the years since. But what we do know for sure is that a large part of it was that you had people just that, because people were so on top of each other, that if something happened in my house, it very quickly affected yours. The Haymarket bombing of 1876 was another major event where, considered in some ways one of the first urban, quote unquote, terrorist events where disputes between labor and corporations during this time were very intense. In Chicago, it's very much a hotbed of that, as evidenced through the Pullman labor strike that also, really affected the entire nation, and showed again, how again these new, different foreign people could really create some levels of instability for the more powerful people. Again, with these people coming in such a short amount of time, there just wasn't all, the housing was oftentimes inadequate. Streets were really dirty. The air quality was poor. And it was believed that, this was all the result of an unplanned city, that if we, could find a way to give some thought and attention to how we want to structure the city, then we could eliminate or alleviate some of these problems. So then again, when we talked about these different models that we began the class with, the City Beautiful movement, the Garden City, the Radiant City, Broadacre City, make sure you understand how to sing it. Don't just be writing this stuff down. Be an active learner. Take time to think through and understand this stuff. Make it your own. On these papers and stuff, y'all can't just be taking my notes that I know I wrote, put them into the paper, and that's not critical thinking. That's some really, something that we should be past as upperclassmen. These aren't always easy tasks. Again, we can take some time during office hours to kind of discuss how you want to unpack these things and how you want to lay them out. Writing and communicating your ideas is not easy. but I also think that you all are more capable than sometimes you may imagine. The first step in that is trying and actually getting some feedback. But please do not feel as if you're accomplishing anything just by writing this down onto your notebook. It's not actually learning. And there'll be evidence that you've learned this stuff when you're able to present it back to somebody else in a way that makes sense, in a way that's, your own. And if I ask, the three of y'all to break this down, like it should be like, some nuance within your responses. Are we clear on that? Do you all think that that's something that you're capable of doing?
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Took a
I do as well. And again, simplify. Get all these people coming, like, the example we gave before. If all of a sudden Allen got like 10,000 students, like for the fall, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to plan it? The same thing is happening here with these cities. Get all these folks and got issues that they hadn't really taken time to really deal with. Chapter 4 of the Chicago School talked about some of the problems that occurred as a result of this lack of planning. So Burnham is introducing some plans to try and alleviate that. So he wanted to have more parks, where again, people like, just on the hustle and bustle and they grind all the time. You can just kind of sit and chill and just, enjoy the day. Again, you got all these folks coming, and the transportation is not nearly where it was today. So he thought it would be a pretty sensible idea to create wider boulevards to make it easier for people to maneuver around. And he wanted to be very deliberate about the architecture of the city, where when you think of like, Paris, the Eiffel Tower immediately come to mind. The Roman Colosseum in Rome. There, and keep this in mind, we're going to talk about this increasingly, that cities were very deliberate about this, about creating certain monuments that kind of like, stand in for their cities, and where if you go there, you want, you're driven to some of those particular sites. When you look on, when they're showing something on TV, we talked about this before, like if a movie starts, and before, the characters may even talk sometimes, they may show us like a shot of the Paris skyline. It immediately lets you know where you're at without anything having to be said. Burnham wanted to, create this, this type of architecture for Chicago as well. He thought that doing such a thing would not only improve, like, people have more pride in the city, and if you have more pride in your city, then, you're less likely to contribute to the pollution and the blight overall. He also thought it would improve the morality of the citizens. Just again, the architecture itself, by making it more beautiful. Again, think about this in the dorms, that if the dorms are nicer and kept up, there's a school of thought that it will impact and improve behavior than if it's just, left to be dilapidated and no real efforts in upkeep. So again, Burnham continued with this plan. He wanted to establish a lot of public parks that the city will be responsible for, establishing and maintaining. In particular, he wanted to take advantage of the proximity to Lake Michigan and build a 20-mile park alongside of it. He wanted to introduce places where people could entertain and fellowship with their fellow citizens a lot more. So he also built a large civic center as well as a new railroad terminal to allow people to get around a lot more efficiently. Some of these things, took longer than others. These changes were, not cheap to implement. But almost all of them were not only eventually realized in Chicago, but are maintained today. Like, including that same railroad system that was like built way back then. I'm only barely exaggerating. They've made some upkeep, but like, essentially, the same centralized system. In spite of this, though, we talked about that a large part of this was done to, um, eliminate some of the atrocities that were going on in major cities like Chicago. And it did this to an extent, but with, more than really eliminating some of those problems, it just kind of isolated them. So the poverty, the crime, the social disorganization, that didn't leave. It just got, like we talked about with the concentric zone theory, it just made it where, and these are things, again, where we're saying like, you want to take notes on what's being said. Like when I'm saying things like the concentric zone theory, and I'm like, highlighting it, that's something where your ears should be perking up. Well, A, is important, but B, it connects directly to this. These are the things that enhance our understanding, as opposed to just writing concentric zone theory on a paper, but not really having an understanding of the full context in which it's used. But according to this theory, again, the more isolated you were from like, the city center, and particularly like the business district, the worse the housing was going to be, the more crime was going to have, the shorter life expectancy, all types of things. And Burnham's plan, again, where, he made great strides in doing some of the things that he aimed to do for the city. It did not eliminate some of those pathologies that the Chicago school academics were initially concerned with. Another model, again, was the Garden City movement, where it was response to, again, appalling physical environments characterized by overcrowded housing and a sharp divide between city and city life between rich and poor, where if you were rich and wealthy in many of these, new urban environments, you lived a dramatically different life than the poor in the city. The Garden City wanted the movement aimed to try and reduce these disparities. So one of the things that they wanted to do in particular was like kind of decentralize, as opposed to, again, we talked about the concentric zone theory introduced by the University of Chicago researchers. So they thought a solution to that might be to kind of decentralize things, if you will, to, as opposed to having all the jobs and activities concentrated in one area, you would have these things, more spread out. Again, you all have to introduce into your papers this notion between Jezel-Schaff and Jimmins-Schaff, the organic and mechanical solidarity that influences the division of labor, but also the norms and values and the institutions that are important in these communities. But the Garden City wanted to try and eliminate that dichotomy and try and create blended spaces that had, obviously, there was going to be no turning back from the Industrial Revolution, but to have a bit more of an agricultural base and influence as well. So this is where you want to introduce like a quote unquote green belt. Again, keep in mind, listen, this is where ears need to be perking up. But don't just write down what I say and when did I say it. Reproduce this for yourself so that you understand that, again, it was believed that, in addition to, again, the divides, the overstated divides in many ways of mechanical and organic solidarity, Jezel-Schaff and Jimmins-Schaff, was this idea of that in the rural areas, you could have a greater sense of community. That's, again, where I talked about that you're going to find fewer homeless people. because somebody gonna look out and like, hey, come on in, we'll give you a meal in a smaller community. In these big urban environments, people became more anonymous. And it was imagined that urban environments is where a community went to die. That everybody's just out for self. Y'all hear me? Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
And again, if there is something that you don't understand, that is totally okay. I can live with that all day. But y'all got to tell me. Don't front and be saying that y'all be knowing this stuff. And then I ask y'all a week from now, and y'all acting like we ain't never talked about this stuff. Then I be losing my mind. After you get these notes today, go back and make sure that you read and review the material and look at your notes before Monday's class. Look at these notes and pair them up with previous notes. Make your own notes. Please don't just rely on mine. And I think this stuff will be pretty straightforward and we'll have a very easy time of it. So here again, before we close, they want to have, again, that it's believed that the environment can create individual behavior. So we can create an environment that breeds community. That if it's believed that, that you can't really have this kind of community and cooperation in New York and Philadelphia and Detroit, that we can create our city in a way where it cultivates that organically. Because many people still wanted to live, and enjoy, an agricultural lifestyle, if you will. They just had to go to these places because, this is where, they had to live, to make a living. Like my parents came to Chicago, but in many ways, like they're still like, country people, if you will. Over time, the economic and social advantages of large-scale city planning became quite evident. That the cities that planned and structured more, they were able to reproduce even more jobs. The businesses that were there were able to work even more efficiently. We'll leave it there for now. Again, keep in mind the model, the focus of the chapter is urban planning. This planning is a result of, again, people coming to, these environments in a short amount of time. Things, they come into very disorganized environments that become more disorganized the less that people plan. This required, set the stage for city planners such as Daniel Burnham, Howard, Cabossier, and Wright, who we'll talk about on Monday. Again, you don't need to know their names, but there may be some extra credit points available for the ambitious student that, in their own words, Stephen, can break down for me what the City Beautiful movement is. Do y'all think that anybody's up for that challenge?
Yes, sir.
Sure. Again, make sure that in doing so, you understand what it was responding to. Then again, we're making it beautiful because it was believed that there are some ugly things going on. Be very specific about the ugly things that are going on. And then tell me the specific solutions that they gave to these problems. You all have a wonderful weekend.
You do the